Was recently tabled in the House of Commons, effectively banning replacement workers during a strike or lockout. Well, today, the federal labor minister was in Windsor to discuss the significance of that new bill. CTV's Rich Garton was there.
Labor had a big week this week. We introduced into the House of Commons anti-scab legislation.
Labor Minister Seamus O'Regan delivering the news at a town hall at one of Unifor's headquarters in Windsor. The federal Liberals and NDP joining forces to table anti-replacement worker legislation. O'Regan says the legislation would ban replacement workers in federally regulated sectors during a work stoppage like a strike or lockout.
Then hanging over them was this.
So I don't like this legislation. Unions are unnecessary. There is a myth that unions are responsible for improved working conditions and higher wages, that during the Industrial Revolution conditions were terrible and the actions of unions are what transformed the economy and working conditions into the much higher paying and safer jobs that we have today. I think that this analysis comes from the Marxian view that employers and employees are sort of in a tug of rope game trying to take each other's profits or obtain higher profits at the expense of the others. So the reality is that wages are a price like any other, and prices are determined by market conditions, by the demand for a particular good or service. So a worker's wage in particular is determined by their what economists call their marginal revenue value product, which is sort of a long way of saying their productivity or how much they contribute to the productive process. So that's sort of the upper bound of how much a worker can get paid, and how close they get to that upper bound depends on the competitiveness of the marketplace. So if you have a really competitive marketplace, a lot of different employers looking to hire workers, then they're going to end up paying pretty close to the marginal revenue product, the productivity of that worker. So working conditions have improved and wages have increased over time, not because of unions or because the government passed a law, but because of the process of capital accumulation. So savings, consumer savings, is channeled into capital accumulation by investment. So this process of sort of reinvesting what's produced, because you have a trade-off between consumption and savings. So you can either have a higher standard of living, or you can put off consuming for the future, and in turn you can save, you can invest, and you can have more in the future. So the reason why real wages have been so slow to increase in recent years is because we no longer have the high levels of consumer savings. In Canada, consumer savings have been nosediving for the last 30 or 40 years because there's so much inflation. It doesn't really make sense. You know, you save $100 and next year it's only worth $97 or $95. You know, your money's being eroded. The value of your money's being eroded. So it doesn't really make sense to save up. In fact, it makes more sense really to go into debt, which is why we have basically a debt-based economy. So unions don't really have the power to affect wage increases. If workers are substantially underpaid relative to their productivity, then other employers can profit by hiring them at a wage between their productivity and their present wage. And so there's a bidding up process that sort of ensures workers are paid close to their productivity. To the extent that unions can increase wages at all, it's by manipulating market conditions. For example, if unions can exclude non-union workers from consideration, which sometimes happens, you know, you have to have if you're getting something done, it has to be done by a union shop. That's a condition of some employment. So, or of some contracts between unions and employers. So if they can lower the supply of workers, then the supply and demand. Supply decreases while demand stays the same. The price increases. So, to the extent that they can increase wages for union workers, it's at the expense of non-union workers being able to be employed at all. And the real problem with unions is that they have too many special privileges from the state. So Bill C-58, the anti-scab legislation, it's a step in the wrong direction. It's continued special privileges. If you want to go on strike, that's fine. That's your right. Nobody can force you to work when you don't want to work. But at the same time, if you don't want to work that job, if you're going to walk out on that job, then the employer should be free to hire somebody to replace you or to fire you. And there's too many laws that favor unions that make it difficult on businesses. So I'm very much opposed to Bill C-58 here. I think it's a bad idea, a step in the wrong direction.
Redmond spends up to $1,000 on medication every month to stay alive. The cost means the type 1 diabetic often has to ration her insulin. Soon, she might not need to.
I think it's going to help me, and it's going to help a lot of other people across the country, and that's what really matters to me.
This is about health equity.
Canada's health minister has now introduced the legislation laying the groundwork for universal drug coverage. To start, the federal government will cover diabetes medication and devices and birth control.
This is a proof of concept opportunity to try on 2 drugs on a universal single-payer model.
But the legislation does not commit Ottawa to cover all drugs.
And it seems that this was a compromise. There's not a rational reason to restrict publicly funded medicines to diabetes and contraceptives. It does not make sense from a health perspective.
Ottawa pledges to create a list of essential drugs it may eventually cover and an agency to bulk purchase medications within 1 year of the legislation passing, which it likely will with support from the NDP. They've pushed the Liberal government to bring in pharmacare.
It also sets a structure for builds a foundation.
So I think this is a terrible idea. For one thing, you've got a moral hazard, especially with opioid medication. Do we really want the government to be giving free opioids to people? If this does turn into full-blown universal pharmacare, which is what the NDP and a lot of people are pushing for. Even diabetes, type 2 diabetes, is it's a consequence of lifestyle choices. So should the taxpayer really be on the hook for insulin when it can be controlled simply through diet alone, simply through restricting carbohydrates? So advocates of the pharmacare program say that the government can dictate lower prices because it's buying in bulk. But I think that there's also the opposite danger, which is that the artificially increased demand from having the federal government in charge of buying medicine, because one element of demand is the ability to pay, and the federal government's basically got unlimited money, then this is going to lead to price increases. That's what happened in the United States when the government got involved in healthcare, starting in the 1970s. The cost of medicine compared to the cost of living really took off because you had restrictions on supply and then artificial demand in the form of Medicare and Medicaid. So the restrictions on supply here would be the patent system, and then the artificial demand, the government picking up the tab, could get very expensive for certain medications. Another thing is that low-income individuals in Canada already have their pharmaceutical care covered by various programs, ODSP, welfare, and that sort of thing. The governments already do about half of the spending on pharmaceuticals in general. So if the low-income individuals are already covered, then it seems to me that this is just an excuse for the political class to find one more way to exploit the economic class, because if it's all funded by tax dollars, then it's put on the burden of taxpayers, which is net taxpayers, that is people who work in the private sector and finance the government. So it's unfair in that respect. I mean, we definitely can't afford it. You know, you look at the record levels of debt that we have, no matter how you cut it. Debt to GDP now is worse than in the 90s when we had the sovereign debt crisis. So there's no money for a massive new program, which could run up to 30 to 40 billion all in. That was the PBO's estimate for comprehensive pharmacare coverage, everything covered by the government. Now, obviously, they would recoup some of that because they're already covering half the spending, and then, of course, Canadians wouldn't have to pay it directly. But given the debt levels, given the size of the deficit, I don't see how this is economically feasible without substantial reductions in spending elsewhere. And I don't see much political will on the part of any of the major parties to really start cutting away at government spending. So all in all, I think this is just a terrible idea. The one saving grace is that it's been a very tentative step in this direction. They're only covering diabetes medication and birth control at the moment.
Be taking to the polls to decide the fate of blanket rezoning.
That motion is defeated 6-8.
The notice of motion was brought forward by Councillor Dan McLean, saying there have been concerns that upzoning every single family home in Calgary would change the character and nature of communities. But ultimately it failed, with many who voted against the motion arguing that a plebiscite, which would have taken place during the next municipal election, was just a delay tactic and politicking. A public hearing on the blanket rezoning policy is set for April 22nd.
Yeah, it's good news out of Calgary. Obviously, we have a huge problem in Canada with the price of rents. I think it was like 7% increase over the last year. Just a really dramatic increase in the price of rents. I mean, you can't find a place anywhere for less than like $1,500. And so rezoning, the missing middle, this is what has to happen. You know, we've had so many decades of policies favor single-family homes, and you know, it makes sense if you're a homeowner, rational self-interest, but for people that are trying to get into the market, it's crazy, the price of real estate in Canada, and rezoning should definitely help bring rents down, help increase the supply. So it's good that Calgary has taken the step to what they've done is basically they said everywhere that you can have single family homes, you can have like duplexes and these slightly more dense buildings. So the proposed plebiscite would have been a vote on that, popular vote by the people, but since, from my opinion anyway, you know, we want the rezoning, it's a good thing that the plebiscite got voted down, and they're just going to go right ahead and do it, and then hopefully, you know, we can see if this makes a big difference, if we can bring housing costs down, help out Canadians that are struggling, which is a lot of people.
COVID during the pandemic is back in the spotlight, and another investigation into possible wrongdoing has been launched, and this time by the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner. Let's go to David Thurton, who is in Ottawa. So, David, more scrutiny on the government's handling of this file just a month after that scathing report by the Auditor General.
Yeah, more scrutiny, and it's hard to keep track of all that scrutiny. By one count in the Globe and Mail newspaper, there are about at least a dozen investigations underway into this travel app, arrivescam, and now we're learning today about another one from the Public Service Integrity Commissioner. We learned about this from a letter that a Conservative MP received and was shared with the media that this office, the Public Service Integrity Commissioner, which investigates wrongdoing within the public service, is adding itself to the number of other agencies and committees that are taking a look into this travel application. And so the letter states that the Integrity Commissioner will be looking at wrongdoing when it comes to the development of this app. The Commissioner also confirms that 2 public service employees made complaints to that office, and those employees are Cameron McDonald and Antonio Utano. Both have been suspended from their work with the Canadian government. They allege that they were suspended because they blew the whistle on what was happening when it came to the development of this app. In fact, they appeared at committee recently and spoke about how they're being scapegoated and also how the allegations against them are false. So have a listen.
The reality is, this document is nothing more than a collection of baseless accusations, unsupported by any corroborating evidence. Accusations of wrongdoing, supported by cherry-picked emails and calendar entries. It should be called the preliminary statement of falsehoods.
So there was some sort of statement that was developed that summarized their involvement and allegations against them, and you heard from one of those employees calling it a preliminary statement of falsehood. So lots of investigations underway. We can add another one to that list from the Public Service Integrity Commissioner.
The arrivescam app, I mean, total waste of taxpayer money. $60 million or something insane that was spent on it, and I don't think they got anything out of it. Like, were people even using this thing? What was the information collected for? I mean, and how do you spend $60 million to create like an app? This is just textbook wasteful government spending and a cover-up on the part of the Trudeau government to hide the malfeasance.